Okay. My name is Valerie Plesch. I am 44 years old and I was born in Washington, D.C. I'm half Vietnamese, half Argentine. My mom is Vietnamese, my dad is Argentine, and they met in Switzerland in 1963. But my whole family is on my mother's side is from Vietnam, from the south of Vietnam, but they were raised in Saigon, and and most of them came here in 1975. But I'll talk a little bit about my grandparents' history. So, well, starting with my mother. My mother was a family of 7 siblings. She's a twin, and she was born in the Mekong River in the town called Quynh H, which is the largest city in the Mekong River. And she was educated along with her family in the French education system. She went to a French school in Dalat, which is in the mountain region of Vietnam. My grandparents were very, what would you say? They were, the higher echelon of Vietnamese society. That's because my grandfather was highly educated. He and his brother studied in France in the 1920s, early 1930s. So they were educated in this town called Marseille in the south of France. That's where he did his high school, his engineering school. His brother became also a doctor, studied did his studies in Marseille, and other brothers, I don't remember what they all did. But upon going back to Vietnam in the 30s or so, they all had very good jobs. My grandfather was an engineer. He built a lot of infrastructure in Vietnam and Cambodia, and his brother was a very highly revered doctor. So the family on my grandfather's side was, they were very well educated and privileged. I mean, my mom grew up in a privileged lifestyle, going to, as I said, to French private schools, boarding schools, and all of that. But my mom did leave very early. She left in 1963. She got a scholarship to study in Switzerland at the University of Geneva to study economics. She was very lucky, very, very lucky that she was chosen, that my grandparents supported her to move there. And she went by herself when she was 17 years old. And that's where she met my father, who was from Argentina. So they were both studying there in Switzerland, and went on to do their master's degree in England after they completed their undergraduate studies in Geneva. Then they got their master's in England, and they moved to the United States. As a American-born person, growing up here in Washington, D.C. area, I was so fortunate that I was able to be surrounded by my Vietnamese family, and for sure that shaped who I am today and the kind of work I do, which I can explain later. But my grandparents lived in a really small little one-bedroom apartment near the Pentagon, Crystal City area, and it was a building that was what do you call that? Subsidized housing for senior citizens. So because of their refugee status, they got all sorts of nice, benefits living here, and so they got this housing covered for them. I think most of it. Anyway, so it was a very, very small apartment, and I remember from what my mom told me and from photos that I've seen, they lived a very privileged life in Vietnam. Big house, a big villa. They were very integrated in the society. They would have a lot of parties at their homes, and French people from the embassies or from who were living there. I mean, it was a very elegant life that they led. But what I saw was this really tiny apartment, and it was just full of things, photos, and things from their past, cassettes that, with Vietnamese songs and French songs that they would listen to. My grandmother was always cooking Vietnamese food in the small little kitchen. Always, whenever we would come, she was really pure, really an angel, full of love and care for all her kids and the grandchildren. We all loved her so much, but she loved, that when we came over there, and how lucky am I that she's only 15 minutes away or so from where I lived. But I just was so fascinated by how my grandparents were living a very, very simple life when they came to the U.S. And when I see photos of them when they first came to America and the years afterwards, they came with nothing. And they left everything behind in Vietnam, everything. And came here just, with a few things and starting life all over again. And I think this really stuck with me growing up, was how someone or a family can start from scratch. And I think that's definitely why I do the work that I do as a photographer, as a photojournalist, as a documentary photographer and writer, why I gravitate towards stories about people who had to flee their homeland, escape a war, and start from scratch somewhere else. Because I feel like I'm, in a way, telling the story of my own family. Even though I did not live that life, I did not escape a war, I did not come here as a refugee, I did not start from scratch, but I was, again, immersed in that world because of my grandparents and my other relatives that did. So I feel it's very much part of me, that experience. I can identify with people who came here. So language was definitely a barrier growing up because I did not speak Vietnamese. Actually, my mom did not teach me Vietnamese growing up. We spoke mostly French and English, and my grandparents spoke French very fluently. So I was able to communicate with them in French, but it was still difficult because French is not my first language. But I think that was, again, very precious that I was able to communicate with them and to speak with them. And how lucky am I that I was able, they could have been just placed anywhere in America, or who knows, in France, or stuck in Vietnam. But everyone managed to come to the area where my mom and father were already living. So I'm very, very lucky for that. It definitely shaped who I am, definitely changed my perspective on so many things. I will say not everyone in my family is I've always been so curious about the refugee experience, and not just my family's, but actually anyone who's come here as refugees, and just that experience. And I feel for my other family members, like my cousins who are the same generation as me, they don't talk about it, actually. I think they're just living their life here, which is great and fine. But I think for me, I feel like it is part of my identity, and I just can't imagine. I don't know. Every day I think about actually, my family, my grandparents. I have photos of them in my home in Washington, D.C., and I can share with this. My grandfather, when about maybe 10 or so years after resettling in America, he actually handwrote his autobiography in Vietnamese, and to have that is, I think, so precious. And there are old photos of him and my grandmother talking about the life growing up in Vietnam, his history, and the life they led in Vietnam, also living in Cambodia, France, where he was educated, and then the last chapter is coming to America. And I think that's really amazing that my my grandfather wanted to spend that time to write this, and and he wrote this autobiography for his kids and grandkids, so we would be able to understand his story. Yeah, I mean, he writes to even here to our beloved children, that for many years we had lived sadly in exile in a foreign country. However, thanks to your profound and wholehearted help, both spiritually and materially, we have been able to enjoy a full and peaceful life. So just to think that in 1987, he was still living sadly in exile in a foreign country, like that's very moving. And this is my grandfather, and I just feel really proud, and it's that I was his granddaughter and that I was able to grow up with him. So I was very close to my grandmother, his wife. As I said, she was such a wonderful grandmother, full of love and compassion for everybody, selfless. And she lived until she was 98 years old. She died about 12 years ago, and she really, I could say, lived a really, really wonderful life in the United States. My grandfather died in 2002, so she had lived maybe almost a decade on her own, and she spent a lot of time with her different kids, at their homes, would spend different months with them, and including my house. And I love that. I loved when my grandmother was staying at my mom's house, and I got to visit her and spend a lot of time with my grandmother. And how proud I am of her story, and again, coming to a foreign country at not a young age, and just trying their best to adapt here, to immerse themselves in a new culture, a new language. It was easier for the kids to do that, my mom's brothers and sisters, of course. But it was already difficult for them. I can't even imagine, people coming here in their 60s or so and starting all over again. But they managed to do it. So did of course my aunts and uncles and cousins who came here in 1975. I mean, we have stories that I hear, anecdotes, and I love that about my uncle when he was still living at my mom's house, because they were all living at my mom and dad's house for a little while when they first came to America, and he got a bicycle and would have to bike miles to a job, in a supermarket or something. But that, gladly, of course, he would do that. These are people that came from a very privileged background in Vietnam, and of course, their life was not the same when they came to America. And of course, that's the story for many refugees. They leave a whole life behind and they start from scratch in a new country, like America. So, yeah, more memories, or pause. Sorry. So, I was a very curious kid growing up. I was probably the most curious out of all the cousins, who wanted to sit at the grown-ups table and just hear, even though all my relatives are speaking in Vietnamese, and I didn't understand anything, but I still wanted to be part of that. But thankfully, I did grow up speaking French. Not great, but I learned it I learned it properly later on, in maybe starting at age 13 or 14. But before that, I was hearing French. I was able to speak and communicate in French. And my grandparents spoke French fluently. And so that was really great that I could communicate with them. Again, it was not at a high level, but great at least that we could converse words. And they did not speak English. They didn't speak English. They came here, and I think it just probably was very difficult, when you're in your mid-60s or so, and to learn a new language. And but but I loved where they lived. It was, as I said, it was this building that still exists because everything is new now in Crystal City, that area, but their building still is there because so many senior citizens from a lower income background, so many immigrants, it's full of immigrants there. That building is still there. And I just loved that they lived in this building because I remember going in there and there were people from all around the world. And my grandmother was so loved by these people in this building, from all the staff, the cleaner. She knew everyone's names. I remember one time I was in the elevator with her, she was probably in her 80s or so, somewhere in the 80s. And one of the janitors came in the elevator and, she knew him right away. She was like, "Hi, Larry," that in her limited English. And of course, he knew who she was. She had an American name there, her Catholic name, which was Mary. So everyone called her Mary at this at her residence, not by her Vietnamese name, but she loved that name too, Mary. So everyone knew Mary. She volunteered at all the activities that they had for senior citizens, bingo night, potlucks, fairs. She was always there. She had so many friends. Again, she didn't speak English very well. She knew some words, but I think everyone just loved how she hugged everybody and would say hello to everybody and was so helpful, was always cheerful. She was definitely a big part of that community, and I loved seeing that. I loved going to these fairs and when they had events at that residence, at the building, and to see her among all these people was really fun. I just loved seeing her interact with other people. Costco, also I think one of the first Costco's that we had in the area also was right across the street. It's still there from her building, and she loved going to Costco. I mean, we're talking about in her 70s, 80s, up to her early 90s. She would go by herself, not with my grandfather. She would go there across the street and get boxes of mangoes so she could give them to all the kids and all the grandkids. Everyone knew her there. She would also, go around and try the food. And there were some Vietnamese people that worked at Costco, and so they all knew her. They all saw her as their grandmother. And I love that. I just love how, that she just, adapted to her new surroundings. My grandfather didn't venture out as much as her. She was the more social one. He stayed, mostly, I guess in the apartment. But he had friends that he would visit, old friends from Vietnam. I remember that and meeting these people that he knew from Vietnam. Can you imagine that you get reacquainted with your old friends that you knew from 50, 60 years ago, and now you see them in Northern Virginia in a post-war setting for them? I just love that. So I'm really happy that he was able to find old friends. So I know he did that. Eden Center also was a big part of my growing up. It's the Vietnamese shopping center in Falls Church, Virginia, that's been around since at least 1975. And my family, including my grandparents, we would go there all the time for family dinners. Even I think on Thanksgiving, we did a Thanksgiving there, or a Christmas Eve, and at one of the restaurants. And there were certain restaurants that my grandparents loved going to. And to this day, when I go around to Eden Center, some of these people still say that they miss my grandparents and they saw them as their own grandparents just because they were just really well loved and people remember them. So I'm really thankful that we did have an Eden Center, this Vietnamese center that was all started by refugees as well, had all the restaurants, the supermarkets, businesses, and how nice that was there for people like my grandparents who came, again, to such a foreign country and could be surrounded by something familiar. And I loved going to Eden Center with them. And I loved going with my grandmother, shopping, eating, and all of that. So those are very special memories. Yeah, being with her, being with both of them. They did not talk a lot about wartime or their life in Vietnam. I'm recalling now that, well, and for a lot of people, it's, painful experiences, painful to think about your homeland that you lost, your country that you never went back to. Like my grandparents from April 1975 until they died, grandfather in 2002, grandmother in 2012, never went back. And that's something that's very hard to understand. But again, so I'm very thankful that my grandfather wrote this autobiography. I would love to have it properly translated in Vietnamese so I can learn more. I do speak to my mom about some of the things, but I feel that I should do something a little bit more in depth to honor my family's history. But I just, again, as a kid, growing up here in Northern Virginia, going to a private school where it was not very diverse, to have my family, to have this other world that was outside of the world, that was my everyday world, I can say, but I had this other world that I felt very connected to. And I should add that my dad died when I was 3 years old. So I just grew up with my Vietnamese family from a very young age. And that's why I identify myself as, Vietnamese-American. I'm so proud of that fact. I'm proud of that as my identity. And it definitely has shaped the work that I've done. I also lived in Vietnam for a year. I went for the first time in 1998 after high school with my family, my mom and brother and some relatives from Europe, and that was amazing to see the country for the first time at 18 years old. And I told myself that after I graduate from college that I was going to move to Vietnam, and I did. After I graduated from college, I moved there for 1 year so I could properly learn the language, so I could just immerse myself in the culture and get back to my roots. And I am the only cousin, my family, and I have many cousins that did that. I still have some cousins who've never been to Vietnam, cousins who were born here. But I lived there for a whole year and learned Vietnamese, how to write, speak, read, still at a basic level. But when I was living in Vietnam for that year in Saigon, I remember writing letters in Vietnamese to my grandmother, Ba Ngoại, and I loved doing that. And she was so proud to get those letters, and that was living in Vietnam. That was very nice. But so fast forward to now. As I mentioned, I am a documentary photographer, and photojournalist. So yes, I cover the news. I cover a lot of stories in this area. But what I'm really drawn to is the refugee experience. So I love telling the stories of refugees. I've done several stories about that. And related to that, I've also done a story about, during the 2020 election, I did a story about Vietnamese American voters who were voting for Trump or who were voting for Biden at the time. And I was going to Eden Center a lot because there were a lot of rallies that the Vietnamese American community was organizing and outside of Eden Center. But that was a very eye-opening experience to me, because a common thread that I saw with these people, especially the older generation, is how the war still affected them. The war was mentioned, leaving by boat, the traumas from the war, and that helped, that those experiences shaped who they wanted to vote for. And that was really, again, eye-opening experience for me as of being Vietnamese American, but I've never now did a story about my own people. I never I just took it for granted that yes, I'm Vietnamese, like, but to report on that was it was very difficult because it was very tough. I would say I was doing it for a few months right up to the election, interviewing a lot of people, and it was a very fractured community. The Vietnamese community, especially during that election, was very divided, and that was sad to see. And a lot of people were very pained or were hurt by that families were splintering because of the war. But again, well, it's not related to my personal experience. My family is, very cohesive. There's no political divisions or anything. So a lot I've been thinking about. Something I've been thinking about a lot is the upcoming 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, and that's such a huge milestone. And that just to think that in 50 years, or people have been here from Vietnam for 50 years. I was just talking to a cousin of mine, second degree cousin. She came here when she was 12, and I told her some months ago, can you believe, Nancy, that you've been here for 50 years? And she's like, what? That's not true. How is that possible? And, so when I think about that, 50 years, that's wow, that's a long time. But to then see how the Vietnamese American community in general in America, I think, in the United States, has evolved. It's really astounding to see them starting from zero, coming to start shops, restaurants, businesses, and how it's flourished, and how now, 50 years later, almost everyone knows what a banh mi or a pho, or loves going to Vietnam. So these are very popular things in today's society, I think, and culture in the United States. So I think it's really great to see, and as I mentioned, like having Viet Thanh Nguyen's book out, and now there's a show based on the book on HBO, and with mostly Vietnamese actors and stuff like that. So I feel like we're really reaching out outside our own community. I have a very dear friend of mine, Tiffany Chung, who's Vietnamese American from Texas. She came here as a refugee, but in the early 90s, she's a sculptor. She's an artist, a conceptual artist, and she had something on the National Mall last summer. She was among 6 different refugee/immigrant artists that were selected to have a project on their their own project on the National Mall in front near the Washington Monument. She had her own installation that actually she's amazing. A lot of her work is about refugees, but the project that she had on the mall was this mapping project that mapped refugees all around the world. And just the way that she did it in her way was so creative, and it was beautiful. And to learn about how Vietnamese Americans are really, I think, coming out of the shell of that maybe we were placed in for a while, because it's hard, there's some stereotypes, among communities, but it's hard to tell your parents or grandparents that you want to be an artist, you want to be a photographer. They would love if you were a doctor, a teacher, or let's do a doctor, lawyer, make that money. But I think the younger generation, my generation and younger, are seeing that there's more to that. There's more to life than just like work, 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 and just make it. Of course we want to make our family so proud, but I think from what I've been seeing, there's been so much creativity among the Vietnamese American community all around the United States. I've seen in California, Seattle, New York, here in the DC area, Texas, flourishing and doing really new things. To see Vietnamese chefs creating these beautiful restaurants as a tribute to their own families, and having these beautiful restaurants that they've created. These young chefs, Vietnamese, whose parents were also refugees. It's amazing. So I think if we could keep going and supporting each other, such as what the Vagabond zine did, I really felt supported and by my own community in ways that I didn't before, because I kind of just was on my own. My mother always supported me, my family, of course, but I think just to be part of a group, and I hope all artists or all creative people in the Vietnamese American community can feel that, can feel supported by each other, and that's how I think it could keep going and continue to flourish, in the new for the new generation for the years to come. So we've already come a long way. So I can't even imagine what we can see for another 50 years among the community. That I think it's going to keep going. There's no way, and I think as I mentioned, I think so much healing can be done through the arts and through writing, through food, through and just different art mediums. So I can't imagine. I think for this young generation to express themselves and what their parents and grandparents went through, leaving a war-torn country in their homeland, and that no one probably talked about it at home, about what happened to them. So the young generation are trying to process, and those who are artists express themselves through the arts. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see what gets passed down more and more to the younger generations about what happened to their relatives who came here before them. I'd love to have an answer, but I don't. But I would like to think that the more we talk about it, the more we express ourselves, the more we write about it, the more we put it in different art forms, we can just really unpack so much of that. So I know I talk a lot about the trauma. I mean, it's something that I do focus on in my work, but really anyone who fled Vietnam, that is a traumatic experience. And so I think a lot of people don't talk about this. And older generation do not. I've talked to so many people among my generation. They say, you cannot even mention the war. You can't even talk about if their father or grandfather was as a soldier or in re-education camp. It's very difficult to talk. My own uncle was put in a re-education camp in Vietnam. Very difficult to talk to them about this, to keep it all inside. So can you imagine, this is what you associate, them leaving war and this is trauma, don't talk about it. That's not good for younger generations who want to know more about their family's history. So again, thanks to the arts, that at least we can express ourselves in whatever the way we feel comfortable doing. So yeah.